when I was asked to lead this discussion on phishing for ISAC, I said, okay, so I'm going to talk about phishing to a large group of security professionals. It seems to me kind of like talking to construction workers about nails. It's like it's such a broad topic. It's such a familiar topic, and it's something that everybody deals with. But my goal for this talk, along with JT, is going to be, hopefully we can at worst give people a refresher for a lot of things that they don't know, get some ideas from some new recent changes in the field, and hopefully you can learn something new, or at least take some information you can bring back to your own team to help improve your own program.
No, that's great way to start, Justin. We've tried to create this presentation with the latest and greatest phishing threats, and hope you're able to take something away from it. We hope you enjoy the show. Take it away, Justin.
All right, so we're going to start off with one that's just I've seen a lot, and that is QR phishing. So I'm just going to go. I'm going to step back from the podium for a second, just on a personal note from the security professional field. Just we got to stop with the ishings. We got the phishing, the vishing, the smishing. It's now quishing. I mean, I don't really know how far this is going to go, but I'm not going to say the word quishing for the rest. It's going to be QR phishing. But this is a new threat that we've seen a lot in the information security field and just in general in fraud, right? So when we're looking at these new QR codes, I'm sure everyone's familiar with them, especially if you're logging in or registering for things like MFA. We use QR codes a lot now. They're great for deployment. Um, but I think what most people don't seem to understand about a QR code is that it's a link. When you look at a QR code, you need to look at it in the exact same way that you look at a link, right? So anybody, you can take the opportunity right now. I promise you that the QR on this page is not malicious. When we teach people about phishing, right? We always tell them the red flags. We tell them, is it unexpected? Is it enticing or threatening? Is it trying to get you to do something, right? The nature of the threat when you see a QR code is that it's not really doing anything. It's just there. You could have gotten this in an email. You can get this in your physical mailbox. People just go and slap these things on park benches, right? And when you see it, you think people just want to take a picture of it, right? So when you take a picture on your phone, what's it going to do? It's going to present, hey, do you want to open this link? It's not going to give you the same precautions that you can usually do in your red flag training, and that's why it's such a dangerous threat that's unique to look out for, right? Because normally we're going to say, okay, check the link, right? Hover over it with your mouse, make sure it's going to work. You take on your iPhone right now, I'll tell you right now, it's not going to give you that opportunity, right? If you have a QR scanning app, you might have the ability to inspect the link prior to doing that, but that is not built in native to the iPhone. And so what I have seen people do is like, oh, it's simple, right? All you got to do is you turn your phone on airplane mode, you disable Wi-Fi, then you take a picture of the link so it goes into a browser, and then you look at the link in the browser. It's like, okay, well that's kind of a lot, don't we think, to try to make sure that what we're doing is safe and not usually how it's going. So what do we do about this, right? And really your best bet when it comes to QR phishing is you have to focus on training, right? It needs to be equated for people that QR code equals link, and it should be treated in the same way that you are treating links from a phishing perspective. You do not click a link if you don't know what it is. You do not take a picture of a QR code and go to it if you do not know what it is.
And I always like to bring like real life into this. So one of the most recent QR phishing incidents was targeted at Sophos employees back in June 2024. Attackers sent spear phishing emails with PDF attachments containing QR codes. These emails appeared to be legitimate, often mimicking internal communications. When the QR codes were scanned, they directed victims to a phishing page designed to steal Microsoft 365 login credentials and multi-factor authentication tokens. This incident highlights the growing sophistication of QR phishing attacks and the importance of being cautious with QR codes, especially in unexpected emails.
Yep.
I would like to say that internal controls over other aspects of the network login process prevented the attacker from gaining any access, but it just brings to life that these things are happening on a day-to-day basis.
Yep. Yep. On a personal note too, I mean, you've seen that outside of the business, people have been receiving impersonations of UPS, FedEx. They'll put it in the mailbox. It'll have a QR code. Says you have a package. If you want to collect, we can't drop it off, but if you want to collect it, scan this and enter your information. Boom, right there, right? So moving on, we've got AI. So I know that I'm sure we're all just very tired of hearing about AI and the new threats related to AI, but unfortunately, this is where it is right now with phishing as well. And the main issue when it comes to AI is the prevalence, right? Again, just like most things with generative AI, you can use this to now have a much broader attack vector as a malicious actor when you're using your phishing. And not only that, it's going to be better phishing. This is no longer going to be the sketchy, misspelled word sort of phishing that's going on. Anecdotally, I've used KnowBefore.com for a lot of cybersecurity training for phishing. They have the built-in feature Ada, where you can actually take it and use AI to generate your email. So for me, I have some clients who have over 500 employees, right? I need to craft a number of phishing emails if I'm going to do a phishing test that are going to have, otherwise, you send one email to 500 employees, it's quickly going to be identified and that information is going to spread through the organization. But using the ADA, it can, you can create a broad number of different emails that are going to go out. The problem was I used the hardest setting for that feature, and the generative AI is able to scan internet pages. It's going to look them up. It's going to create spearfish attacks using actual names from the organization, actual logos, actual things that are relevant to the people that it's receiving, and it's going out there. I ended up having an issue where we had a huge fish prone rating from employees because it spearfished 800 people, right? At once. So you just take that example of somebody who's doing it on the back end from the information security perspective. Now take that hand and put it in the hands of a malicious actor who's going to be taking advantage of this. You can see where we're going from here, where it's going to continue to get more prevalent and more difficult when it comes to a phishing perspective.
And once again, to bring it into real life, there was a recent AI phishing incident which involved cyber criminals impersonating OpenAI in a large-scale campaign. Attackers sent emails pretending to be from OpenAI and urging recipients to update their payment information to process a monthly subscription. This tactic aimed to steal sensitive financial data from businesses worldwide. Just like Justin said, AI-powered phishing attacks are becoming increasingly sophisticated, leveraging advanced techniques like voice and video cloning to deceive victims. Staying vigilant and verifying the authenticity of such requests is crucial to avoid falling victim to these scams.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about phishing as a service, right? So you have organizations that you can hire to fish for you. You just provide them the targets and what you're looking for. I mean, that's what AI is, right? We talk about Copilot for your Windows OS. We talk about ChatGPT. These generative AI tools that can be used as an assistant to help you do it. Well, now it's available to everybody. It's not, you don't have to find and create that sort of connection. It's just available widely. So that ends up really increasing the threat vector there. And we're going to talk a lot about controls that we can work to prevent these sort of things later in the slides. But this is it's very relevant as we continue to see the impacts of the generative AI.
And I do have one kind of question that did arise here. Can you give me details about the concept of spear phishing? That was one question that was kind of just posed a minute ago.
Yeah. So if you think about the normal, I'd call it like a spray and pray approach to phishing, right? Where you're just going to send the same junk emails to 1 million people that you have from some sort of a verified email list that you see sometimes from scammers. That's not spear phishing. That's just sort of the general idea of phishing, because you send it out 1 million, if 1% of people click the link and provide their credentials, you've received quite a bit of data there, right? What spear phishing is that it's researched ahead of time. There's reconnaissance involved in the phishing attack, in which you are going to gather information on your victim. Could be from social media, could be from internet pages, things that are known as LinkedIn, whatever it might be. And you're going to phish them with stuff that's going to make it seem more believable to the person, right? You're going to know the projects they're working on, and you're going to send them emails with links related to those projects. You're going to send them emails from their superiors if you know who they are from an organizational perspective. It's that sort of thing. It's basically phishing with reconnaissance beforehand.
And just like everybody does, when you're sitting there, if I wanted to fish Justin and all that stuff, I would do it. It's called open source intelligence, or OSINT. And I'd sit there and I'd go on his LinkedIn page and I'd see where he'd been and what he'd done. Then I'd go on his Facebook page and see about his family or whatever it may be, and try to get a connection to sit there and basically understand why do you want to fish a particular thing. So it's actually spear fishing is targeted. That's why they call it spear fishing.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much,
Great
guys.
question.
Um, so deep fakes, right? We've been seeing a lot of this. Most of it's something pretty entertaining. But I was on an information security awareness training call with a group last week, and I remember I got thrown during the Q&A just very casually. How do you identify deep fakes? Or can you give it, Garrett, can you give us some tactics to identify deep fakes? To which I said, no. You know, I can maybe give you some, but they might not be relevant next week, right? I mean, we looked at the early image generation for AI. They used to say, look at the fingers, right? Because they just had this weird thing where they couldn't make five fingers on the hand. It always looked like something out of a cartoon. So, but we're well past that at this point, right? The idea with generative AI, it's generative. We're growing, it's increasing in sophistication, and so they're getting less and less easy um, to spot. And it's for that reason that you should not be focusing on identifying deepfakes, right? You should be focusing on authentication, right? So if you talk about somebody that you're talking to on a call, or you're talking to, either video and audio, right? Just because you recognize that person does not mean you have authenticated that person. When you see somebody's face or hear somebody's voice, right? That's the identify, right? I have identified that this is who I am. Okay. Authentication is okay, now prove it. So I worked in banking for many, many years. So tellers on the line, they have customers that come in every single day, right? They call same people, they recognize their voices, they recognize their faces. And the person comes in, it's like, oh, hey John, how you doing? Good to see you, right? You can talk to that person all you want. You can be familiar with them, you can have a conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to, as soon as you get into a call, be like, prove who you are, right? But the moment that known customer wants to take action, they want to make a transfer from their account, they want information, they want to pull something out. Okay, it doesn't matter that I see you every single day. I have procedures to authenticate you now, and you need to follow those procedures properly. There's no harm in talking to a scammer. There is harm in giving them information. So when the IRS calls me on the phone, you know, I I I don't recommend everybody do this, but I love talking to scammers on the phone. It's just uh, professional curiosity. But it's the moment they ask me for something that it's like, okay, I'm not going to believe you're the IRS until I didn't believe you were the IRS to begin with. But you need to prove it now before anything's going to be happening. There are some tools in place that can help with this right now. So if you use Teams, some other video channels, they will show authenticated, or sorry, verified next to the person's name. That means that there was a digital authentication that happened for that person to enter into the meeting, right? If you're ever on a Teams call, you'll see if you have people outside your organization, some say unverified, some say nothing. It just means you have that authentication that's happened and that's helped, right? And another thing that can be done as well is, and I've seen this, is by policy, cameras need to be on, right? You cannot do camera off, especially if you're an unverified person. Now, again, the technology is getting more and more advanced that the camera on, camera off might not make a difference. But just taking somebody's voice is not necessarily enough. You might want to potentially enforce that when it comes to your meetings.
And to bring another real world example here, there recently was a deepfake phishing incident, which occurred back in February 2024, involving a Hong Kong-based multinational company. Scammers used deepfake technology to create a convincing video conference with the company's chief financial officer and other employees. During the call, the deepfake participants instructed an employee to transfer funds, resulting in a loss of approximately $25 million. This incident underscores the increasing sophistication of deepfake technology and the importance of verifying the authenticity of video calls, especially when financial transactions are involved, just like Justin said.
Yeah, exactly. So these are some just new threats that we're seeing there. We're not going to go too detailed into some of the things that we've already seen for a long time. So we want to move into the controls. But when it comes to talking about our controls against phishing, the very first thing that we think of is phishing testing. I mean, at least that's for me, right? Now, JT and we got together last week, and we said, let's start preparing our information. What do we want to talk about? Very first thing that came up, obviously, was discussing how to our thoughts on phishing testing. We then proceeded to argue for about 30 minutes on the nature of phishing testing. I'm from the Northeast near Boston, so that's just how conversations go anyway. But we realized very quickly this is going to be very difficult to present in a topic for phishing testing. So we're not going to go into too many details when it comes to phishing testing. If people have some specific questions, we can definitely go into them and up for discussion. But I want to present Nick food for thought. This might be a good panel discussion, right? And I use the word discussion in quotes because it's really going to be a debate. I mean, you get two security professionals into a room, you've got three opinions on phishing, right? So it ends up being quite a hot button topic, and a major fuel for that fire was, I believe it was last year, there was a Google security blog post by the man named Matt Linton, who's a security manager at Google. He has an article called "On Fire Drills and Phishing Testing," where he basically just tore into phishing and made a case for why phishing testing shouldn't exist anymore. It's sparked a lot of debate on that, and people still discuss it now. And also, we talk about we want to provide good data for this. The data on the efficiency of phishing is hard to track, right? It's just such a subjective topic that seeing the benefits of it or seeing the negatives of it or whether or not it is being effective is very difficult to understand and subjective depending on the customer, depending on the company. So,
and even though we might have had a louder discussion than normal and all that stuff, I think we actually came out on the same particular page. I just came forward with I believe that the real key to cybersecurity is psychology. You need to know how your employees think, but more importantly, you also need to know how your attackers think. By appealing to our biases and emotions, phishing tries to get us on specific principles such as authority, commitment, liking, you want to be liked, perceptual concept. And we sat there and had these particular discussions to where I don't know if anybody ever read a book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Daniel Coleman and all that stuff, but it was always you wanted to be in system 2 was actually thinking slow when you're actually going through email, but we all know that going through email, we can't exactly be slow all of the time. But I think we did come up at the end, we just might have took different paths to get where we needed to go.
Yeah, we both want to increase your security program. We just have, different opinions on specific things. But we're not going to get into that argument again because we'll take up the rest of the time with that.
Panel discussion.
I had a question come in too.
Oh.
Very, very interesting question. Actually, I like this question a lot. Can biometric detection also be manipulated by deepfakes? See a yes from JT.
Yes, very much. Biometrics, kind of like when you're sitting there and you're looking at your iPhone and all that stuff. When you're sitting there and you have face recognition for your camera iPhone and all that stuff, your camera iPhone is just looking at 3 points. And if an attacker can sit there and duplicate or manipulate those 3 points, they can easily get into your iPhone. So those biometrics, you have to understand, they're not actually taking your fingerprint and going that far and all that stuff. They're just taking points in time and actually comparing to that what they have on file. So if they can interrupt that transaction, it can easily be hacked.
Yeah, I would agree with JT on that. I still remember the early face detection technologies on the old Alienware computers, but you could hold up a picture of yourself and it would just let you in. So, and then obviously they increased that verification process, but so is the ability to manipulate these things, especially when it comes to deepfakes, AI, that sort of thing. So I would never be comfortable saying no to that question. I think it would always be a matter of maybe, right?
Let me, I guess I'll add a little question onto that. What's next then? Do you think there's, what forms of biometric detection do you feel are the most secure, if any? I mean, should we be giving a small blood test to sign in every time, possibly?
I would disagree with that. I think it's more of actually a multi-factor authentication than relying on one particular one. I think any particular individual authentication method can be hacked. I don't really have to sit there and cut off Justin's finger to sit there and get his fingerprints and all that stuff to get onto his phone or anything like that. But I think it's really important that we sit there and Justin and I had a conversation the other day about multi-factor authentication, and we couldn't believe that if it's anything of value to you, if you don't have multi-factor authentication up, then we kind of were at a loss of why were you trying to actually protect it and all that stuff. So I'm going to say I would vote for multi-factor authentications because there's 2 different factors, 3 different factors, or whatever it may be, because I think a single factor can always be hacked.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with JT. I mean, we can have a whole discussion about which are the strongest forms of biometrics. I mean, it really usually comes down to data points. So if you things like fingerprints and retina scans obviously have way more data points and are harder to replicate. That being said, the important thing to keep in mind when it comes to biometrics is it's a how close did you get situation, right? It's never a this matched perfectly. So there's always a false positive and a false negative rate when it comes to biometrics, whether and finding that balance. So
And to give you an example, when I used to work in the military back in the olden days and all that stuff, we had biometrics and everything like that. But when I had an eye cold, I couldn't even get into my office because my retinal detection and all that stuff was all skewed off. So there's positive stuff, there's negative stuff, there's good in everything that we have to do. But I always say you probably look at the NSA, probably look at Intel to get the best and brightest.
Very good answers, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the question.
all right, so we're gonna go through some of the controls, but I want to start with the before the inbox controls, right? So in terms of just actually preventing the phishing from happening at all, right? And it's not really good news because it's really just you can't. But there's a few things that you can consider in terms of what you want to implement, right? So we talked about spear phishing earlier, and the idea that there's reconnaissance before spear phishing. The first recommendation would be being very cautious when it comes to what you are putting on the internet, right? So for an organization, how much detail do you want to be putting about your internal staff, projects, that sort of thing that's available, what you're putting on LinkedIn, what you're putting on social media. We always talk about being cautious about what you're putting on social media, right? The more data that's out there, the more the reconnaissance can be used for the spear phish. That being said, I do understand that that depends on the industry you're in, right? So if you're a private company, you don't have your employee base, salary information, projects, contracts. That's not public information. You're working for a municipality, that's not the case, right? You're working for a state institution, that's going to be publicly available information, and unfortunately, that's why you see a lot of things like municipalities getting hit with major fraud, wire fraud, because people are able to phish them very easily with the amount of reconnaissance they can do.
I think when we're talking about defending ourselves and all that stuff, I know Justin and I like to talk about the MITRE attack framework and all that stuff and the 14 steps that you have to go through and everything like that. But I think what we're looking for when we're talking about before the inbox, when we do phishing training, we talk about the red flags, we talk about this, and we talk about all of the stuff that a user is done. But I don't think we actually concentrate or articulate what IT and what information security does in the background. We don't talk about the network segmentation that we put in place. We don't talk about the access controls, whether it's SSO or whatever it may be, where we make things easier for you and whatever it may be. Monitoring and logging, audits, uses of honeypots and all that stuff. When we sit there and we talk about before the inbox, it's basically there's so much work that goes on before the user comes into play to where the user at that particular time might be the last defense against when we get to like step 4 execution or whatever it may be. So I always like to sit there and give kudos to where kudos is done and all of the hard work that IT and information security do before the inbox gets involved.
Yeah. And right now, when it comes to whether you're using Google or Microsoft for your email system, there's filtering that goes in place there. There's known malicious senders that are known by by just the intelligence gathering that is available from those companies. And honestly, there isn't much to do often when it comes to the filtering. It's a built-in filtering. You can sort of adjust, you can whitelist different things, but it's going to be hopefully pulling out enough. The biggest thing I think a lot of people want to consider would be things like quarantine. How do you want to handle it when there's an uncertainty? What about confidence of whether this is malicious or not? Do we want to stop it? Do we want to allow it to go into quarantine so somebody can take a more cautious look at it? And also we want to look at active and inactive links. And I would actually say the same thing for attachments, right? So you can use different filtering when it comes to, is the link going to come in there active or is the link going to be pulled out of emails? Same thing when it comes to attachments will be pulled out that you can retrieve it if you need it. Or it'd be detonated and then reattached in a copy. But again, a lot of these things, JT talked about security enables business. You pull the links out of every single email in your company, that highly depends on clicking links all day, depending on the department you're going, you're going to be slowing down operations quite a bit with that sort of a thing. So it's really going to be a business decision on how, whether that is an effective and, worth putting that control in place. So again, before the inbox controls aren't perfect, at best, what we're doing here is just reducing the volume of phishing emails, but you are going to receive phishing emails, right? It's going to happen. So the biggest focus we want to do for this presentation, therefore, is focusing on what the goal of that phish is. And that comes down to really two things. They're trying to gather credentials, and they're going to try to introduce malware into the system. So the controls in terms of phishing is really going to be dealing primarily with those two things. I am going to put sort of again, an asterisk on the end of that. There's maybe one third one, which could be they're seeking to gain financial data, like they're just trying to get you to make a wire transfer or something of those nature. That being said, I think that more falls under the category of fraud, and we want to focus more on information security, so I didn't include that so much here. And that's mostly going to be handled, honestly, by processes anyway. So, and how you have to do things when it comes to controls around taking those sorts of actions. So again, we're going to focus on what we do about credential gathering and malware introduction.
And the reason this came to mind and all that stuff, I remember the day just like it was yesterday and all that stuff. I was sitting in the C-suite and we were sitting there and talking about phishing results and all that stuff. And I had one of it was either the CFO or the chief admin office says, so I get phished. So what? What can they do and all that stuff? And it really made me think about, because I could sit there and go and to attack vectors, attack surface. And I'm going, if you sit there and you just get down to it, brass tacks and all that stuff, if I can get to credentials, I can do a lot behind it, where you're talking about the fraud, getting into the information, doing transactions or whatever it may be. Same thing when actually, if they dump a piece of malware on my particular machine, they could be sitting there and putting a remote keylogger on my machine and they get my credentials that way. So sitting there and just looking at the first thing that they're really looking for phishing, and that's the credentials and the malware and how we can actually defend against that.
So starting off with the credentials, the first thing is going to be I don't think I've ever given an information security presentation where I haven't had the word MFA somewhere in it. So again, it's going to be MFA, right? Introducing that second factor. We talked about biometrics, the strength of different aspects of it. It's so much more effective to have that second factor involved. And we also want to keep a special focus on phishing resistant MFA. And I actually had this conversation with a client yesterday. There's sometimes this common misconception where it comes to phishing resistant MFA just means that it's something that you couldn't obtain like a biometrics. Biometrics does not necessarily mean phishing resistant MFA. It's not as easy to obtain because you could just tell somebody something or steal something you have. But what phishing resistant MFA means that it would also stop from adversary in the middle attacks, right? So if you're going to be facing an attack in which somebody's going to be trying to steal your session, the phishing resistant MFAs will be preventing that. So I think the biggest one that's kind of emerging right now is FIDO2. I really do see FIDO2 moving into being more and more prevalent as years go by for two main reasons. One, it is phishing resistant and incredibly strong when it comes to actually authentication. And the second is that it's going to become easier to do. So FIDO2 essentially operates by having a physical token that is in your computer. It can also be a smart card. And that's going to be part of your authentication. It's going to be that's something you have. And because it's got a certain persistence when it comes to the authentication, the session cannot be hijacked. Now, moving into the future, one thing that you're actually starting to see even now is that if you have a smartphone, certain smartphones, and unfortunately iPhone is not one of these at this time, if that smartphone is Bluetooth enabled, which they all are, and your computer is Bluetooth enabled, you can actually have your smartphone function as a FIDO key, okay? Which is going to be tethered to your computer. So right there, just by having your phone within the vicinity of the computer, you're able to authenticate in that sort of a way. You can combine that with a second factor like a biometrics or a push note or a push notification, whatever it might be, and you can easily authenticate. Now we talk about using those two, the biometrics plus the FIDO key, that's passwordless, right? So now we have secure phishing resistant authentication that's almost instantaneous. That's going to be a major selling point as we move into the future for moving into authentication and moving into that passwordless space.
And the reason, I mean, let's be honest about things and let's take it back to the beginning and everything like that. Multi-factor authentication became relevant because we're really bad at passwords. We're really bad at creating passwords because you have to remember them or whatever it may be. We didn't have those passwords managers to help us out or anything like that. We had it on a yellow sticky sitting on our screen and all that stuff. Or you sat there and everybody on that particular watch floor had the same password and anything like that. So sitting there, and multi-factor authentication has become relevant because if you're sitting there and trying to do any type of investigation post an incident, we want to be able to, with a certainty, sit there and say, no, this is the person that did that, other than saying, this is the login that did it, and we're not exactly sure who did it.
Yeah. Yeah. If the new NIST draft guidance on passwords is not any indication that humans are bad at passwords, I don't know what is, because I mean, they're talking to stop making people change their passwords, because the more you make people change their passwords, the more they're going to choose, November 2024 exclamation point as their password. And that's, and that's very easily obtainable, just or able to be hacked through a birthday attack. So
isn't it your dog's name and the year he was born or something like that,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, yeah, we won't get into that, but moving into this password space, it's a win-win, right? Because everyone hates passwords, and it's faster if it's implemented correctly. All right. And again, IS training, information security training, it's going to be your central control when it comes to the human element of things, which is a primary part of phishing. But specifically when it comes to credentials, we want to talk about, okay, when people are getting phished, are you including red flags in your training? And I think that most information security training will include phishing red flags. That's more of a gimme for what would be included in terms of content. But that other second important step is, are you training your employees on what to do if they get a phish? So let's just say you have a technology that if they report the phish, you can take action on it and protect the rest of the organization. If you're not training employees on one, to report them, and then if you are reporting them, how, right? Maybe you want them to use the built-in Microsoft or Google report phish button. Maybe you don't. Maybe you want to disable that and direct them to something like the report phish button that you can get through softwares like KnowBe4. Again, you want to include how to handle the email. And as a second part to that, I can't tell you how many times I would see that people would report the emails, but they would do it by forwarding it to the IT department. You just increased the threat vector. You just sent a link. As an IT and IS professional, I'm still a human being. I get tired, and sometimes I click links, especially if that link is coming from an email from an internal source, right? So we want to be careful about training people on how to handle the phish as well as identify it.
And when we mention these red flags and all that stuff, the attackers are reading the same blogs that we are and all that stuff. They're reading, they understand what we're training our users on when it comes to red flags. That's why they're using all of these AI tools that they're using in the phishing for our service and all that stuff. They are designed to trip those red flags and all that stuff. So what I'm saying about this is we have to do the basics. We have to do the cyber hygienes to make sure that we at least do the bare minimum type of things. But we also have to understand, just like I think we sat there and talked about phishing and understanding what your users and understanding your adversaries, understand that your adversaries are looking at these red flags also and crafting their phishing emails to avoid those particular red flags.
Yeah, and I think a good sign of a successful information security program in which you're training people how to handle phishing is when you have a decent false positive rate, right? When you in IT or IS are getting emails that are saying, is this a phish? And it's not, right? That's good. That means we're being more cautious instead of less cautious. All right, so that's the credentials. So let's move into malware protection. So, a lot of this stuff is kind of a duh when it comes to information security, but I think we want to go a little bit deeper into each one because there's implementation details of how you want to do that. So again, when it comes to protecting your endpoints, we want to have a baseline configuration, right? We want to be removing unnecessary software and processes and disabling unnecessary processes as part of a deployment prior to it going out, right? That's your first step. You want to have a patch management cycle. right? You want to, obviously you're patching your devices, but are you auditing that cycle? So are you following that up with vulnerability scans and policy on how we're going to be implementing things? Like, so we want to be looking, are you, do you have critical patches must be within 30 days, high within 60, medium within 90, or however you're defining that. And then do you have procedures when it comes to 0-day exceptions? So when we have a log4j situation, do we have procedures for ad hoc patching and how we're going to get that through efficiently and in an approved manner? When it comes to pulling reports for vulnerability scanning, a clean patch report is an oxymoron. That doesn't exist. So there's no such thing as a clean patch report, But if you're pulling your patch reports based upon your policy, so for example, if you're going to have a policy that has the 30, 60, 90 for your critical high mediums, right? Okay. Do a vulnerability scan, pull the reports for criticals over 30 days old, highs over 60 days old, and mediums over 90 days old. Okay. Now you actually have the potential of a clean patch report because that's all we really care about. With Chrome, there's a critical patch that comes out daily. You're always going to see that. But has it not been implemented in 30 days? That's where you're going to be auditing that program. Are you whitelisting softwares, right? So do you have a whitelist of approved softwares that can be on devices? And are you ensuring that when softwares are being added, they're being added from secure software sources? And with that as well, are you going to have endpoint protection on every single device? But those 2 points right there, right? How are you enforcing that? Is it by policy and just by training, or are you using an MDM solution to enforce compliance on these devices that says, they're not going to be functioning on the network unless they have what is expected when it comes to the whitelist and what's on it. Excuse me.
There was a reason why I actually, and I wanted to move down to exception handling because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. And I actually asked Justin to highlight this particular one because if I'm talking to a bunch of information security folks and a bunch of IT folks, I know there are several people out there who have talked to IT and saying, I can't put endpoint protection on my servers because it will break my system. They have no evidence that will break their system and all that stuff, but they'll sit there and say, if I put that endpoint protection on my server, it will break. Now, once again, I've had so many of these conversations going back and forth, but there's a process in place to sit there and say, okay, I will trust you. I will believe you. It will break your system. And I do not want to be one that breaks your system because I'm here to enable business. But you're going to sit there and say, instead of continuously using endpoint protection, on a monthly basis, you are going to sit there and kick off a scan of your server so we can feel comfortable that we've at least done some kind of scanning on a monthly basis. So these are the big things, especially when you're talking about endpoint protections to where, I've heard it, God, for many, many years to where, oh, no, the first thing they'll do is they'll sit there and blame endpoint protection. And it looks like Nick's hands up. So I'm going to go to Nick.
Never actually used that feature before. I like that. I have 2 questions here. First one's kind of a higher level question. Could you give a very brief explanation as to what is endpoint protection?
Sure. I think the word antivirus doesn't necessarily cover it anymore. It's sort of an antiquated term. So endpoint protection is going to be there's going to be some degree of response. It's going to be happening. Also, virus is too specific. You need to have some sort of it could be an EDR, it could be a standalone endpoint protection. You could have an MDR, an XDR. That's where you got a managed system where they're going to be able to take actions, quarantine. I think moving into that next level when it comes to endpoint protection is there's going to be some type of automated action that can happen. Whether it goes further could be dependent upon the service, but compared to just a detection or just an initial block, there could be some quarantining or other threat hunting happening.
The next one, sorry, JT, go ahead.
No, I couldn't have said better. That was perfect.
The next one, not sure, more of a comment or question. We often get the question from users, is this email safe? We help them look for red flags and tell them to check with the sender, all the usual things, etc., without uploading a potentially legitimate document full of PII to VirusTotal or similar services. What are some safe ways to check it out?
So Oh, I see what you're saying. So you want to be cautious about reporting an email to an external source that might contain MPPI.
That sounds, yeah, that sounds like the gist of the
Yeah, I mean
question.
that's a legitimate question. I don't necessarily have a great answer when it comes to when you do things like the Microsoft report button and the guarantees that that's not going to go into a private space. I think you want to take caution around that.
But and I'm going to take this one from a different perspective and all that stuff. We're going to have, there's no guarantee. We're not looking for 100% that we're not going to happen. Breaches happen all the time. Forwarding PII happens all the time. That's why we have controls in place to sit there and say, policy says we do this when forwarding PII. Policy says we do this. If we, had forwarded PII, we have an incident response perspective that we have to go by. I'll go from my healthcare perspective to where if I have less than 500 EPHIs, then I think it's by February of every year to actually report that data breach. But if I have an excess of 500 EPHI incidents and all that stuff, I have a very accelerated timeline where I have to sit there and do things and all that stuff. So once again, I'm going to go back to policies and I'm going to go back to procedures on policy should sit there and address and say what you should do, but you're not looking for the guarantee. And then when that guarantee does not happen, you have good policies. And maybe if it happens too often, you need to have a playbook in place to sit there and give that compensating control and saying, this is how we do business.
Yeah, and I think understanding your data flows is also key. So you're talking about if it's going to a third party for review, you want to understand who and where the data is flowing, and and also making sure you've got proper NDAs and BAAs in place to protect that data if you do need to go to an external source.
Thank you both for those answers, and thank you for those two questions. Just a reminder to everybody as we enter the final 10 or 15 minutes of the webinar, feel free to pose any questions as they come up.
So just finishing off the slide here, again, just backing up to what JT said for having procedures to handle your exceptions, right? And those procedures, they need to include proper approvals for exceptions, documentation for exceptions. JT talked about the compensating controls. You can't just say, oh, sure, you can't have endpoint protection. We need to put additional controls in place to make sure that we're at least compensating for the risk that we're now introducing to our environment. And that we're also tracking exceptions. Exceptions to policy cannot just go into the ether you should never have an indefinite exception. That does not exist. You need to set a timer on that. In my opinion, some people will say 1 year. I don't think it should be longer than 6 months. If you have an exception in place, it should be revisited. It could be a quick revisit, but it needs to have a timer that's going to go off after 6 months to a year saying like, hey, do we still need this? And let's take a critical look at it. Or if it's an application vulnerability, maybe your endpoint protection is breaking a core application for your business. Are you doing the due diligence to reach out to that third party and say, hey, endpoint protection breaks your application. Can you do something about this? Or is this on your radar to fix in your next release, right? So make sure you are also doing your own due diligence when it comes to ending the exception if possible.
And I'm glad Justin actually did said a difference between, there's a difference between an exception to policy and a risk acceptance and all that stuff. Each system admin and all that stuff should have exceptions to policy that they're doing on their particular business application and all that stuff. And how that affects their business application would in turn, we'd look at the assets, we'd look at the information, and we'd sit there and say, okay, is this vulnerability enough in our environment that it's going to exceed our risk tolerance and we need to proceed to any type of risk acceptance? So I just want to make sure that there's a difference between an exception to policy is basically says you're doing the patch 306090, but you didn't meet it and you can't meet it and all that stuff. So that means you need an exception to your own policy. Risk acceptance is something totally different, and it kind of like one flows into the other.
Yeah. Yep. And then the last thing I just want to state on the slide is, again, information security training. So knowledge about malware is part of your training, but does your information security training include an emphasis and very clear directions for all employees on what to do when they see malware, when their computer starts flashing with all different things going on, or they just start seeing something suspicious? Do they know the action to take, right? Give them clear instructions. It could just be as simple as call this number, right? And then we make sure that they have that available. It could be an easy contact on the phone, or it could be a matter of something more detailed if you think you can handle that from an employee perspective of, would it be unplug the network cable, whatever it might be, in order to handle it. Because again, if your information training talks about the dangers of malware, but don't tell your employees what to do when it happens, then you're not really getting the full scope of what they need to know. All right, and then again, from a network perspective, implementing controls to protect against malware when it comes to phishing. So obviously, a firewall in place. That's a no-brainer. It'd be very weird if people didn't have firewalls. But again, it's not just a matter of how a firewall is the firewall being managed and updated, right? So are you doing periodic audits of the policy suite within your firewall? You're pulling that out. You can run it through a checker that can provide some vulnerabilities. You can hire a third party to do an analysis for that. Is that being done on a periodic basis? Do you have a schedule for that? And also, are you part of a threat intelligence, threat sharing group? That's going to be providing things like known malicious IPs. Things like CISA that can show you no new ones. And are you updating your firewalls appropriately with that information? Or maybe they're doing it themselves, but having an understanding of that those things are being updated. And then network segmentation, right? Your network needs to be segmented appropriately, but network segmentation does not mean that you just have different IP structures for different areas, right? That's not sufficient. Your network should be segmented. There should be access control between those segments. There should be a firewall between those segments. And you should maintain a matrix of permissions between them that demonstrates between segments A and B, A and C, whatever it might be. This is the access control between them. This is the allow for the data flow. And then it's enforced again with those technologies. All right, and then just to end it off, I want to just throw in two honorable mentions that don't necessarily land in those categories. But the first one's going to be cyber insurance, right? Again, cyber insurance is going to help you to compensate from the loss that could be resulting from a malware or credential or breach when it comes to a phishing attack. But one tidbit I do want to throw in here when it comes to your cyber insurance: make sure that there is not language in your cyber insurance that is going to make exceptions for if the loss was caused by human error through social engineering, right? You want to be looking out for that sort of a language, because if you're not covered, then you're going to be in some trouble.
And on these particular things, we're going to take it from a risk-based perspective and all that stuff. There's no cyber insurance anywhere in this world that is going to stop a breach, that is going to stop a hack or anything like that, but it will reduce the impact if something like that has happened. Same thing with the SOAR platform. It's not going to necessarily, it might reduce it if you can find the hack sooner or whatever it may be, but it's there to reduce the likelihood of something bad happening. So we look at that from a risks perspective. We wanted to make sure that we mentioned both of those.
Yeah, and SOAR platforms, security orchestration, automation, and response. A good example would be some of these ones that can help you with your emails. So we talked about teaching employees to report properly. Well, if you have a SOAR technology that allows an email that's reported to be analyzed and then to actually see where else it went in your organization and to use that technology to actually pull it out of people's inboxes, okay, that's a great control. It is dependent upon sometimes a reported phish. So if the users aren't reporting it, you're not going to take advantage of it to the best degree. But again, those can be very helpful technologies for, again, reducing that likelihood. One person reported it, you can pull it out of 10 more inboxes.